Let me introduce you to three words, proscriptive, prescriptive, and descriptive, and apply them to our understanding of the Bible. The word proscriptive means to proscribe something, which is to say to forbid it. A lot of people think that the Bible is primarily proscriptive, that it's full of thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that. And of course there are a few of those. For example, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, and so on. Those would be examples of proscriptions, that is to say, things that you are not to do. And the Bible does, as I said, contain some of those, but not really a whole lot. If you were to read the Bible from beginning to end, all 1,000+ pages of it, you wouldn't find very many proscriptions. Some people think that the Bible is prescriptive. A prescription we're more familiar with than proscription because we all know about prescriptions at the pharmacy, right? The doctor writes a prescription and tells us that we should take a certain medication so many times a day with water or on an empty stomach. That's the prescription. And when somebody's being prescriptive, they're prescribing for us something that we should do, unlike proscription, which is don't do. So with prescription, you would have the Bible saying, do this and do this and do this. And there are certainly a number of those things, actually probably more in there about prescription than there is about proscription. But the Bible is not primarily proscriptive or prescriptive. It is primarily descriptive. I mean by that in most cases the Bible simply describes what people are doing. It describes Samson getting shaved by Delilah. It describes, Daniel in the lion's den. It describes Jesus with his disciples. It describes Jesus healing people. It describes Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. So the vast majority of the Bible is actually descriptive, and it simply tells us what is or what was. And it simply describes it for us and allows us then to, in a sense, determine our own conclusions based upon what we know about God and about ourselves and about other people and about the story. So if, for example, it describes King Saul, who didn't do a very good job of listening to God and got into trouble and ultimately failed as a king, we might assume from that description that it would probably be a good idea not to be like King Saul. Instead, we might assume that it would be a good idea to be the way King David is described, as being a man who is after God's own heart. So, one of the things that we get in the Bible is a lot of stories. In fact, the Bible is really a storybook more than it is anything else. It's not really a law book. It could be, but it's not. You don't have a whole lot of laws in there. You do have some, but it isn't primarily a law book. If you've ever read a law book, you know that it's all about, section 2, paragraph 5, subsection B, you shall not under these circumstances do this, and if you do, here's the penalty. There's some of that in the Bible, certainly, but not primarily is it a law book. It also isn't primarily a book of morals, that says do this and do this and do this. Now, again, there is some of that, but it's not primarily that. It's mostly, more than anything else, it's a book of stories. And in the stories, we are given the opportunity to read about people who did it right, read about people who did it wrong, and in many cases the Bible doesn't even tell us what conclusion we should come to about those stories. For example, it describes Solomon as having 1,000 wives. Some people assume from that because Solomon is described as having 1,000 wives, that we should also go out and have multiple wives. But I don't think that's the point that the Bible is making. The Bible is simply reporting the fact that Solomon did have a harem with 1,000 women in it. Now, on the one side, the positive part of that is that Solomon was certainly very powerful, very rich. He was a great king. The downside of it was that many of those 1,000 wives got him into trouble, and he would have been better off without them. So we are left to conclude from the description whether this would be a good idea or a bad idea. This is one of the reasons why when the Bible is read, it needs to be read like a storybook. It needs to be read straight through. The stories need to be heard, and the stories need to be understood in their historical and cultural context, so that then we can figure out what the stories mean. The primary story in the Bible, of course, is, no question about it, the story of Jesus. There's no doubt that the primary and most important story in all the Scripture is the story of Jesus Christ. And he, in fact, could be said to be the story of the Bible. Who he was, all the prophecies leading up to his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection. He is the central character. And the stories either prefigure him in the Old Testament, or they unpack what he was and what he did in the New Testament. So as you're reading the Bible, please keep these distinctions in mind. You might even ask yourself as you read the Bible, is this proscription, is this prescription, or is this description? And it might help you to get a handle on just how better to understand the Bible for yourself.